Hey everybody, it's Jason Blaha here, and today I want to talk to you guys a little bit about dips and chin-ups and why in a way they are like squats and deadlifts for the upper body, the pros of them and the cons, because there are drawbacks of these exercises from a programming perspective. So let me put on my +5 hat of weaponsmithing, work on skill at my crafting a little bit, and let's talk about this. Now this comes up a lot because again, occasionally people will say, Jason, your channel only promotes the big three, which is comical because I promote things like the overhead press as a primary lift. I'm really big on weighted chin-ups, all of those things. In fact, I think even power lifters can benefit from this. I think power lifters need to do chin-ups. All competitive power lifters do. But when we start comparing exercises, we usually think of the squat and the deadlift, at least people who've looked at the data and the research, we think of them as full body exercises. They are two of the best exercises ever invented because they have the ability to train your body top to bottom to get strong. They're full body exercises. In fact, what we know from data is that they create a systemic effect. So a noob, obviously not a more advanced lifter, so I don't want people to think that I'm telling you that you could build 18-inch arms doing just squats and deadlifts, because that's probably not going to happen unless you've got mind-blowing genetics. Maybe on a lot of drugs, or you're really fat. So that's not going to happen, but we do know that noobs who get in the gym and start gaining weight, and this has been studied in high school football players and stuff decades ago, that if they just get strong on the squat and the deadlift and they don't do anything else, their arms grow. Like their arms, bicep measurement will go up by a full inch sometimes within a few months just from those two exercises. Even though those muscles don't get worked directly in the way that you would think, they put so much stress on the entire body that there is some systemic growth stimulation, particularly combined with a lot of food. And the other big deal that we have is that these are two exercises that move your body through space. The Russians figured this out decades ago during the Cold War, that exercises that move the body through space seem to have additional benefits beyond the direct muscle fiber recruitment in the primary movers. They seem to create a certain systemic response that seems to stimulate growth, strength, everything else that exercises where your body doesn't move don't always fully replicate. They seem to have a small advantage. So when you start coming over to things like the chin-up and the dip, you get a similar response, but primarily just in the upper body. But when we start looking at these exercises, EMG data has taken chin-ups, for example, and what is it that we found? They work other muscles that a lat pull down, for example, doesn't work. They work more muscles than what you would think of. In other words, the moving the body through space causes other muscles to get work. We've noticed, like on chin-ups, for example, that your upper chest actually gets stimulated enough to get a small growth response. Your abdominals actually get a very intense training response from a chin-up. Just a normal chin-up works your abdominals as much as a crunch does when we hook electrodes up to measure what's going on. So a lot of other smaller muscles all through the trunk get worked on a chin-up that a more stationary exercise where you just pull a similar movement do not work. And it's these additional stabilizer muscles involved, because when you move your body through space, it requires more stabilizers. So in a lot of ways, this is very much like a squat or a deadlift. And the same thing with dips. We could argue purely from a muscle fiber recruitment perspective that the weighted dip might be slightly superior to the bench press because of, again, moving the body through space. So in a lot of ways, that makes these total body exercises for your upper body, because they work so many other muscles. It turns out chin-ups work things like your upper chest. They work the long head of the tricep. They work your abs. Dips work all the muscle that a bench press works, plus some additional stabilizers and things through the trunk. So these exercises tends to work enormous amounts of muscle. In fact, we could argue that if you got really strong on the chin-up and dip, your entire upper body would be reasonably well developed. I'm not saying you might not want some extra shoulder work and things, because you probably would, but you wouldn't have very many lacking muscles in your upper body. If you did enough volume and got strong enough on these two, you could actually build a relatively impressive upper body off of these two exercises alone. So they give you an enormous amount of exercise economy. The downside that we have to them comes from a programming perspective and a range of motion perspective. And so this is where their downside is. Because if we go purely from the ability to recruit as many muscles as possible through the body, these two upper body exercises probably outdo everything else out there by a small amount. They're superior from a muscle recruitment perspective, which makes them amazing exercises. But again, the problem we run into comes to programming, microloading, and things like that. And that's multifold in nature. Multifold in nature. Number one, because they are like squats and deadlifts for just the upper body, an enormous amount of your body weight is part of the amount of weight you're lifting. In other words, it's really easy to get past your own body weight on a barbell squat. To be able to do a deep ass to grass squat, most people who follow a basic program can squat more than their body weight on a barbell within a very, very short period of time. And it's not uncommon for completely genetically average natural lifters to get to a double body weight squat who actually work on the squat. That's actually totally normal, to be able to put double their body weight on a barbell and squat it, which again, their body weight's in there too, but because your legs get partially taken out of the movement, your entire body weight isn't always part of the movement, and then you're in multipliers of your body weight. How many people out there can do a chin-up or a dip with an additional weight of their body added? Very few. So your body weight itself becomes a very, very big part of the amount of weight you're moving, a much, much larger ratio. So if you look at that from a programming perspective, what's the problem we run into? And you've got to track your weight every day to actually really know how much weight you have, right? And that's normally not a problem. It's not a problem because you can just weigh yourself, right? And you can add your body weight to it and know what you're lifting day to day. But when we start talking about micro loading, that becomes a big problem, because a lot of times on upper body lifts, as you're programming, you have to make very small jumps, 1 pound jumps with micro plates, 2.5 pound jumps. Things like that become very, very common on upper body exercises. In this case, it's a lot more tedious to track that. So for a lot of people, they just kind of stick with the amount of weight they're doing, and you track it from an RPE perspective. And that's fine if you're in tune with your body there and you just go based upon overall fatigue, but it does make programming a problem. And very, very closely monitored programming and progression is actually one of the ways to ensure that you make progress. So because of this, there gets added an extra degree of complexity to absolutely ensure perfect programming, to ensure progressive overload in a way that your body's going to adapt to. So they're a little bit harder to program. Now, the other conflict we run into is lack of being able to determine a terminal range of motion. With a deadlift, it's easy. The bar starts at the floor and it ends when you lock your shoulders back at the top. There's no ambiguity. On a squat, once you learn how to squat correctly, you know how to go all the way down, because you'll find you'll reach a position once you get your everything set correctly to where you're going to automatically bottom out to the same part every time. It's easier to judge based upon things like when your hamstrings rest on your calves. There's a lot of different factors there to where you can more objectively measure your depth. And you're locked out when you stand up at the top. Now we get over to barbell exercises for the upper body. With, say, a barbell row, like a Pendlay row, it's easy to do this. The bar, when it touches the floor, it starts at the floor as the bottom, and then when it hits your chest, you're at the top. You have a way to consistently track range of motion. The same thing on the bench press. This is one reason the bench press is a good exercise in spite of some of the issues about it, because you have your chest to rest the bar on. You have a hard surface where you know you're at the bottom of the range of motion. When it touches your chest, you're at the bottom, and when you lock your elbows, you're at the top. There's no ambiguity on the range of motion. That makes programming, again, easy, because consistent range of motion is required to know how much work you're doing. In other words, if you have exercises where you can trim 2 or 3 inches out of the range of motion, particularly at the hardest parts, and not realize that you did, what happens? You may not be working all the muscle fibers correctly. You might have workouts that seemed easier and harder than others because of your inconsistent range of motion with the same weight. It can make programming problematic. When we go to the dip, what's the problem there? You can always judge the lockout. When your elbow's locked, you know you're at the top, but what about going down? It's much harder to judge depth on a dip, and people have a tendency as they get heavier to start shortchanging the range of motion. The other problem is that because it is possible on a dip to go to a range of motion that can damage your shoulder joints or tear a pec, people tend to start shortchanging it when it becomes difficult, and then if something goes wrong, they can accidentally go too low with a weight they're not strong enough to go that deep with, and go 4 inches deeper than they've ever gone with a weight that heavy, and then tear something. So it has a degree of risk involved because of no exact terminal range of motion, and the terminal range of motion is actually beyond the safe limit for most people's physiology. So it means that the risk of injury at the bottom is higher because of inconsistent range of motion. You don't have anything to stop, like the barbell stopping on your chest on a bench press, to prevent you from going too deep. And you can consistently train your mobility and strength at the joint angles you're going to work with a bench press because of that. On a dip, it can become far more difficult to do that, and it can put you in a compromised position. Chin-ups tend to be the same way. The bottom, it's easy to tell, but people skip the bottom when it gets hard, so they start short stroking the bottom instead of pulling from a dead hang. Like for me, I've learned to only do dead hang. You guys saw me years ago. I did some weighted chin-ups, and I was stopping an inch or two short at the bottom. And in retrospect, that was a mistake on my part. So that's footage of me up doing that, so I don't want to sound like I am telling you guys I've always done it right and perfect, because I haven't. And I've displayed bad stuff on the chin-up because of that. But you know, I'll go ahead and own that. I'll own that. In retrospect, that was a mistake on my part, and that wasn't teaching it correctly by me demonstrating that. So I'll make that clear. I will own that mistake. Now I know better, and now I realize that. You know, we get wiser with age sometimes. A few more gray hairs in my beard. So it's easy to do that, but then once you learn to get the dead hang at the bottom and it becomes harder, you can't do as much weight, we run into the same problem at the top. The problem we run into at the top is that, again, different bars, it can be hard to reach the top. A lot of times if your chest has to touch the bar, okay, but oftentimes different bar handles get in the way if you go to a different chin-up rack than normal. So you start hitting those with your shoulders before you get to the top. Or the issue we run into, the terminal range of motion on a chin-up at the very top, usually the highest you can possibly go, what happens? Not only is the lift harder, but your lats and things start working less. In other words, realistically, if your goal is to build your biceps and lats as strong and as big as possible, there's a point to where when you get about here, your biceps aren't working anymore. So if you pull yourself up further, you notice it's just your shoulders rolling under so that you can get your chin over the top. It's not working the biceps anymore. In fact, the lats become less of a primary mover there too. So the reason the hardest part is the top, and we will judge it and say, well, you know, I mean, a chin up, you need to go your chin all the way over the bar. Well, for a lot of people's physiology, the main muscles you were trying to get the most stimulation in aren't doing that part of the lift. So you're adding extra range of motion to do that. Now, that would give you a more consistent range of motion because now you're doing a full exercise top to bottom. But again, we get to a point to where the very terminal end of the range of motion on this exercise is de-emphasizing most of the muscles that you were trying to build up. And even if you're doing chin-ups for powerlifting, I don't care whether it's powerlifting or bodybuilding, we're not getting the benefit we necessarily want by doing that very top. The only benefit we're now getting is that from a programming perspective, we know we're doing a consistent range of motion. So we fall into a gray area at the top of the exercise of what is your effective range of motion for your goals. What's your effective range of motion? And we could argue the very bottom is good for stretching the biceps and lats, right? So that should be done, particularly for a power lifter who's doing chin-ups to help avoid bicep tears on the deadlift. Getting that stretch at the bottom is real beneficial. But at what point do we stop at the top? And even if we realize our goals only require us to come to here because we're just using it primarily as a bicep builder, lat builder, rear delt builder, long head of the tricep, all that stuff, we don't need to go higher than right here. But at what point are we being ambiguous, and then we start trying to program it, and then we start going a little less and a little less and a little less when it gets heavier? We may be lifting more weight, but we're also skipping a very hard part of the range of motion for those because we have a somewhat ambiguous range of motion at the top. Again, it can create a gray area for programming. So these exercises do have their drawbacks. They are amazing exercises. They can help people with an enormous number of training goals. I think they're good exercises for most people to do, but you do need to be aware that there are drawbacks in terms of programming, micro-loading, effective range of motion, safe range of motion, that do need to be considered with these two exercises. And as far as all the other end of it, that ambiguity, I don't think there's a black and white answer there. You're really going to have to assess that and be honest with yourself and your goals as far as what you need to be doing specifically on that, particularly on figuring out those terminal ranges of motion. Because again, we fall into a slightly gray area at the very terminal end of each of those exercises in one position. That's a subject of a lot of debate as far as the effectiveness, safety, everything else. All right, guys, but that's really all I have to say on that today. I hope it's been informative, and I will talk to you guys next time.